Well, welcome to today's notes on the excretory system. We're getting down towards the end in terms of systems. We've been looking at the circulatory system, digestive system. We've looked at the respiratory system recently, and now onto the excretory. But if you remember, at the beginning of this unit, I told you that there's going to be a few different questions on this next test, including one question that is going to be asking, why are we talking about the respiratory system and excretory system in the same unit? And there's a theme that we're going to be asking you to be able to identify. It's not a part, it's not the fact that they're both inside the body. That's true, of course, but there's a connection, a theme that's present within both of these systems. And as part of the reading that's been assigned, or as part of these notes, see if you can begin to identify what that theme is. It is one of the questions on the test. Again, what does the respiratory system and excretory system have in common? And for the excretory system, we are going to be looking at kidneys, we're going to be looking at the bladder, we're going to be looking at the urethra, and basically the process of being able to get rid of waste in the form of urine. The function of the excretory system is to remove toxic nitrogenous waste from the body. And so we're going to need to figure out what this nitrogenous waste is and why it's toxic and where it's coming from. And in animals, this involves the kidneys and the urinary bladder. We're going to be learning more about these kidneys in a moment, but we have a diagram that kind of shows us the general shape of these kidneys, the fact that they are connected to the circulatory system. So we're looking at the renal artery. If you remember from the circulatory system, that the renal artery delivers blood from the heart to the kidneys, and the renal vein that is going in the opposite direction. But also these ureters and then this bladder. Figure out how this all works. This is an example of a kidney, a cross section of it. When we do the rat dissection coming up at the end of May, we're going to be seeing where those kidneys are located and identifying a very, very thin ureter. Removing nitrogenous waste. The fact that it has the name nitrogenous would tell you that nitrogen is part of that waste. And the only organic molecule that we've been describing so far that has nitrogen in it is proteins, right? Proteins are made out of amino acids. In fact, we identified the amino group as part of the general structure of an amino acid. Here's that acid group and the central carbon and the R group that makes each amino acid unique. Well, in the process of breaking down proteins, digesting them and processing them chemically within the body, amino groups break off, and that amino group can become toxic. And so as part of the excretory system, the goal is to get rid of that nitrogenous waste that comes from the breakdown of proteins during metabolism. And worth identifying again that that's the amino group. Excretion then would be the removal of nitrogenous wastes from the body. And so we excrete them. We don't secrete them, that would be through our skin, but excrete them through the kidneys and on out through the bladder. When nitrogenous waste is first produced, it's initially produced as ammonia. In fact, ammonia is NH3. If we go back to our diagram here, nitrogen, 1, 2, 3 hydrogens, this amino group is by itself ammonia. And ammonia is very toxic. If you have ammonia at home in a container, like we see here, you probably use it as a cleanser. It helps to sterilize surfaces because it kills cells. It would be very dangerous to your own cells too, and so you have to be very careful when working with ammonia. And in your bodies, when you break down proteins and break down amino acids, you do produce ammonia. And that ammonia is just as toxic inside you as it would be on the surface that you are trying to clean, to the cells, the bacteria, and so forth that would be killed. For some animals, this is how it's gotten rid of, that the body produces this ammonia and then you get rid of it, and we'll learn how that works in a moment. But for us, that particular type of waste has to be converted to a less toxic form. Otherwise, we'd be secreting or excreting ammonia nonstop. We're constantly producing it. So we're going to have to make it into a less toxic form so we can hang on to it for just a little bit longer. And that other type, for all other land animals, includes things such as urea and uric acid. These are less toxic forms of nitrogenous waste. And when the body is able to convert ammonia to urea, or even further into uric acid, it involves less water loss. For land animals, that would be really important, as you're going to learn in just a moment, because we don't want to lose so much water that we have to go get more water. And so again, all organisms produce ammonia first, and then if they don't want to lose a lot of water, they're going to have to convert that ammonia to urea or uric acid, both of which are still toxic, but they involve less water loss. Why do we have to get rid of nitrogenous waste? Well, again, they're toxic, they're poisonous to the body. They can affect the brain and the heart and bone joints first. Gout, for example, is a situation where uric acid crystals build up in the toes and in the foot, and you yourself may have had gout if you've had painful toes over a period of time because of the buildup of these uric acid crystals, this nitrogenous waste. While that might be painful, continued exposure to uric acid crystals or urea would end up damaging the brain and the heart and so forth, and of course that's not good. This gout that I've described here then is the buildup of uric acid crystals and can be very painful in the toes in particular, or any other joints, but usually we notice it in the toes first. Well, as I said, all nitrogenous waste that the body produces, regardless of what type of organism it is, produces it first as ammonia. And if you're swimming in the water, as this goldfish is doing, then this ammonia can be secreted or excreted directly through the skin. This is not a problem to the fish, because as toxic or as poisonous as that ammonia is, being in that water allows you to wash the skin off very quickly. The only problem is if you're a goldfish and you're trapped inside a fishbowl, you're constantly swimming in a solution that is building up with more and more ammonia. If you have a fish tank at home, you may have measured how much nitrogen is in that water as a measure as to when to start to clean the tank. Again, if you're a fish, washing off that skin from the ammonia is not hard unless you keep swimming in it. But again, having access to water, that's not a problem. For us, we don't have that much water. We don't swim in water. And so we have to convert that uric acid to something that's involving a little less water loss. For most terrestrial animals then, they don't have access to lots of water, and so they have to dilute that ammonia, or at least convert it to a less toxic form. The only exception would be something like earthworms. For earthworms, especially if they are in moist soil, they can excrete that ammonia through their skin and then the ammonia washes off. But for most of us, we don't, again, have access to that much water. And so as a result, we need to produce urea, or if we are an insect or a reptile or a bird, we'd convert that urea to these uric acid crystals that involve very little water loss. Most reptiles, or many of them at least, iguanas and so forth, might live in a desert type of environment, and so how much water do you have access to? If you're a bird, you also don't necessarily want to be drinking lots of water to get rid of that nitrogenous waste, because the more water you consume, the heavier you are, the tougher it is to fly. For humans and mammals, we have kidneys that help to get rid of the urea, but it does involve some water loss. We're taking a look at a rat dissection like we're going to be doing later on, and we see the two kidneys here on either side of the hips. Speaking of the hips, the kidneys themselves are located above the hips on either side of the spine. You have two kidneys. You can live adequately, I guess, with just one, but two kidneys to help you filter as much of this nitrogenous waste out as you produce. And the nitrogenous waste gets mixed with a couple different items to produce urine. When you make urine, that is including this urea, the nitrogenous waste that we get rid of, as well as salts that we don't need anymore, and any excess water to help flush the system out from all this nitrogenous waste. The average person makes about 1 to 2 liters of urine each day. If you do the math, that's slightly over 1 milliliter every single minute. It's quite a bit. Additional parts of the excretory system include the liver. We've mentioned the liver now in every single unit, and the liver is involved with the excretory system by combining this ammonia with carbon dioxide gas to form less toxic urea. So in some regards, I guess we kind of sort of do need the carbon dioxide gas that we produce. We just don't need that much of it. But in order to make urea, it involves adding carbon dioxide to it, to the ammonia. To be able to get the blood from the liver to the kidneys, it's going to involve moving that blood through the renal artery. In this diagram here, it's not labeled directly as the renal artery, but that arrow indicating blood with wastes going towards the kidney, that would be the renal artery. And then when the blood gets into the kidneys, there are little filters inside the kidneys that are called nephrons. Each kidney holds millions of these little filters, millions of these little nephrons that help to filter the blood. And so as the blood comes in through the renal artery, it gets diffused out or spread out to each one of these different nephrons. And we're going to explain how these nephrons work, shown here, how these nephrons work to help filter the blood. This cartoon diagram shows a nephron. Here's the blood supply coming in, and then this whole thing here is the nephron. We're going to learn how some things are filtered out of the nephron and how some things need to be reabsorbed. There's different parts to the nephron to help it do its job. But by the time we filter the blood and then process all of that, by the time we're done, all that we should be left with is urine, water, salt, and urea. The blood supply that fits with the nephron is called the glomerulus. So the renal artery comes in, and these little tiny capillaries that are found that are connected to the nephrons are called the glomerulus. So small branches of the renal artery that fit inside something called Bowman's capsule. We haven't mentioned Bowman's capsule yet, but this long gray thing, this whole thing is the nephron. And as part of the nephron, there's this little cap or cup that fits right up with the glomerulus. So we've got the blood supply coming in and the beginning of the nephron called Bowman's capsule there. Bowman's capsule is the part of the nephron that filters out urea, water, and salts to become urine. However, Bowman's capsule isn't that selective. And inside your blood we also find glucose, we find some amino acids, and those are small enough to fit through the filter that is part of Bowman's capsule. And so there are some things that initially we're taking out of the blood that we want to get rid of, urea, water, and salts, but we're also getting rid of some things initially that we don't want to get rid of. We don't want to get rid of glucose. We need that for energy. We don't want to get rid of amino acids. We need that for making more proteins. And yet initially Bowman's capsule is taking out more than it should. This cartoon diagram is kind of showing that. Here we have the blood and the blood supply. This glomerulus that's flowing in is releasing the water, salts, and urea, but there are some things here that we're going to have to pump out. As part of your diagram, it's worth labeling this cup part as Bowman's capsule. Notice the blood supply here, glomerulus, but your diagram does not have Bowman's capsule labeled. So Bowman's capsule takes out more than it should, and the next part of the nephron, this long part here, especially this section here, is called a tubule. And the tubule's job is to reabsorb water as well as amino acids and glucose. In fact, 99% of the water taken out by Bowman's capsule is reabsorbed by the tubule part. So Bowman's capsule takes out way more than it should, and the tubules part is to reabsorb those amino acids and glucose that we want, and also some of the water too. In fact, a lot of the water, 99%. So here we are back to the cartoon diagram, and here we are trying to recover, scoop up some of those amino acids and sugars, and also pump out some of the also some of the water, osmosis over here, reabsorb some of that water. That cleaned blood is then returned to the body through the renal vein. So here we have the diagram that shows cleaned blood. It's not labeled as renal vein. Wouldn't be a bad idea to label it in your diagram. And that renal vein's job is to be able to bring blood from the kidney back to the heart. The urine that's been produced is now ready to leave the kidney, and it's going to leave the kidney through a long thin tube called a ureter. The ureter is the tube that carries urine from the kidney to the bladder, and that ureter leading in this diagram down here to the bladder, that bladder stores the urine, and then the urethra would be the tube that carries urine from the bladder to outside the body. These ureters, by the way, are very, very thin, and in the rat dissection we're going to identify where they are, but boy, they look like little pieces of dental floss. There's not a lot to them. And lastly, at least in terms of how the process works, we have the ability to figure out how much water to reabsorb. Because certainly there's times during the day when you're exercising and you're sweating water. There's other times of the day when you're drinking water, maybe drinking quite a bit of water, and the body has to be able to adjust to know how much water to get rid of. If you're dehydrated, you certainly don't want to be getting rid of large amounts of water. And if you've been consuming large amounts of water, well, maybe it's time to pee out a little bit more. The way the body knows how much water to reabsorb is through the action of a hormone called ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. This hormone tells the kidney to reabsorb water. So let's pretend for a moment that you've been exercising a lot, you're sweating a lot, it's a hot day, and you've been, losing a lot of water through your sweat glands. At that point, you don't want to pee out a lot of water. And so your body would be releasing a lot of this ADH to be able to tell the kidneys to reabsorb as much water as you can. On the other hand, if you've been consuming large amounts of water, your body would not produce much ADH at all, allowing the body to pee out all that water that you've been consuming, if you need to. This leads us into some problems that the kidney might encounter, or problems that the excretory system might have. And one of those involves alcohol. Alcohol is a diuretic. Now to go back for a second, remember, anti-diuretics tell the body or tell the kidneys to reabsorb water. Diuretics, on the other hand, would tell the kidney to be getting rid of as much water as possible. And so when someone's been consuming alcohol, they need to pee a lot more frequently, and sometimes with urgency too. In other words, I've got to pee, and I've got to pee now and in large amounts. That alcohol is a diuretic. And one of the old myths that's out there is that if you've been consuming large amounts of alcohol, you get a hangover, and with that hangover you should probably drink large amounts of coffee to help wake you up. The only thing with coffee is that it contains caffeine, which is also a diuretic. It increases the water in the urine. So this hangover that you have, as a result of having lost a large amount of water, you're dehydrated. By consuming the caffeine, you're only worsening the problem. Yeah, you've got some caffeine in you, which might help perk you up a little bit, but that hangover is still going to be very, very pronounced because you're going to lose even more water. Nephritis, anytime you have ITIS, remember we have an infection. And in this case, we have an infection of the nephrons. This means that bacteria has worked its way from outside the body, in through the urethra and in the bladder, all the way up the ureters and into the kidneys. you really shouldn't have bacteria in your urinary tract or in your excretory system at all. In fact, your urine should be 100% clean. If people are in the army, if they've been wearing their army boots for quite some time, if they're out there in the field and they start to develop toe infections or fungal infections, foot issues due to large amounts of bacteria and fungus and mold growing in the boots, one of the things that the Army recommends doing is to pee on your feet. As gross as that might sound, your urine should be 100% sterile. There shouldn't be any bacteria in here. That urinary tract infection can be painful, and if that works its way up to the nephrons, that can lead to kidney failure, which would be a major problem. You need to get rid of that nitrogenous waste. Kidney stones. Kidney stones are a buildup of uric acid crystals in the kidneys, typically because you either have large amounts of urea, so you've been consuming large amounts of protein that you need to process, or that you've been consuming large amounts of salt, or you're not getting enough water in your diet. And these kidney stones that form in the kidneys themselves don't feel too painful until they start to move through the ureter. And if you have known anyone who has had kidney stones, you know that they can be doubled over in pain and are out of commission for a while. Here's some kidney stones that are shown here. These are centimeters. However, there's 2.54 centimeters per inch, and so, well, some of these kidney stones are darn close to about 1 inch in diameter. Even so, the ureter isn't really that big. It's not that wide. And so they have to scrape and scratch their way down, causing that person again to be doubled over in pain. The pain goes away when the kidney stone reaches the bladder. Unfortunately, at that point, there's just one more pathway for it to travel through the urethra. And so there's one more round of pain to go. There are treatments for this to try to get rid of them, maybe break it up through ultrasound a little bit to try to take these larger kidney stones and break it into smaller bits. But if you have kidney stones, there's no way to go in and surgically remove them or anything else like that. So you just have to pass them. And two more problems to deal with. One is diabetes insipidus. This is a type of diabetes that involves extreme thirst. What's happening here is the body's consuming large amounts of water, but because the kidneys can't respond to ADH, because your body can't reabsorb all that water that you've been consuming, you continue to pee it out. And so ADH involves large quantities of dilute urine, diabetes insipidus. And then lastly, kidney failure. There are a lot of different causes for kidney failure, and you're going to be doing a lab activity later on in this unit to take a look at some of the different problems that we can detect as a result of looking at the urine. But in one case, we're going to be looking at kidney failure, and so a lot of different causes as to why somebody might have kidney failure. But with kidneys being so important in filtering out nitrogenous waste, individuals who are undergoing kidney failure have to go on dialysis in order to filter the blood. There's absolutely no way you can survive without filtering out that nitrogenous waste. And ultimately, an individual who is experiencing kidney failure is going to require a kidney transplant. And that kidney transplant won't necessarily always replace the kidneys that are there, but actually might get hooked on to the ureter and also the blood supply in a different spot. And then finally, do plants have an excretory system? We've been looking at plants every single unit and describing what they do to overcome the fact that they don't have a heart or they don't have lungs. Well, remember, the excretory system involves the removal of nitrogenous waste from the breakdown of proteins. Well, we definitely consume proteins as we eat, but plants, on the other hand, they don't. They don't really produce large amounts of nitrogenous waste because they don't eat proteins. I know there are some exceptions with Venus flytraps and those sorts of plants, but even they don't consume a large amount of protein. They're just capable of doing that. They still do a lot of photosynthesis, production of sugar, and so forth. And so as a result, not producing a large amount of nitrogenous waste, this means that they don't have an excretory system. They don't have a way of dealing with it. It's just not going to be a problem for them. So this one becomes a really easy, simple thing to remember. When asked whether or not plants have an excretory system, remember the answer is no. They just don't produce a large amount of nitrogenous waste. Well, if you have questions about any of this, please let me know. We're, as I said, going to be doing a lab activity based on this. And then there's also that reading, and hopefully the reading will help reinforce a lot of the things that we're talking about here. Enjoy the rest of your day.